Um, one of the more famous individuals who actually started hanging out at Coffee and Confusion during this time was a young teenage Jim Morrison. And I touch upon this in my biography on Morrison. The Lizard King was here. What happened was Morrison grew up, in a military family, and they settled in Alexandria, Virginia in January of 1959, and they remained in Alexandria until June of 1961. Morrison attended George Washington High School down in Alexandria. During these years, he started hanging out at different nightclubs and coffee houses in Washington, D.C., and one of his favorite places was Coffee and Confusion. And he first started going there with a friend of his named Jim Merrill, a classmate. And Merrill told me, well, Morrison used to go up here and he got to know the guys who were running Coffee and Confusion. I would see him talking with these fellows, and they told him about Bohemian Caverns, so we started going up and hanging out there. And what happened was that Jim Morrison at one point actually got up on stage at Coffee and Confusion and gave a poetry reading, which I thought was highly significant because it was the first time that Morrison had ever performed in public like that. And I think being exposed to that bohemian environment and having the opportunity to go up on stage and recite his poetry, it really kind of launched him in the direction of becoming a performing artist eventually. Now I wanted to kind of get some verification on all this. I did locate a couple people who were there the night Jim Morrison gave his poetry recital. John Hutter and Maggie Phillips, two of his classmates, and in the book The Lizard King Was Here, I go into their testimony. They kind of recount what happened that night. And I also wanted to track down Angelo Alvino Sr. Many people told me that he had been shot and killed sometime in the early 80s. And what happened was his son told me that there was a drug deal going on. His story was that Angelo was trying to buy some methadone for a female friend of his who was hooked on heroin. And the deal went astray, and Angelo was shot in the head and left for dead. And there's no documentation on it. I couldn't find any articles in any of the local papers on it. However, Angelo Jr. told me that his father was in a nursing home down in southern Maryland. And I actually drove down there and paid Angelo Alvino Sr. a visit, and there he was, and he was paralyzed from the neck down, but he could talk. And according to Angelo, he said he and Bill Walker knew Jim Morrison. They knew him only as Jim. They said he was the only high school kid who kept coming back. And he said he remembers sending Jim up to Bohemian Caverns, and they remembered that he was very interested in the poetry. And he said didn't give him a thought for years, and then the doors came out, and somebody came into him with one of the records and said, Angelo, this is the guy that used to come into Coffee and Confusion. He said he recognized Morrison as being that teenager. Sadly, Angelo Alvino Sr. passed away this past February. And one of the certainly colorful, legendary characters of DC's music and cultural scene is no longer with us. Coffee and Confusion remained open until, I believe, April of 1963. And it was a beatnik hangout the whole time, although the situation was slowly changing. Coffee and Confusion was important because it inspired other similar coffee houses to open. Remember this time period, late 50s, early 60s, things were much more conservative in the city than they are now. Java Jungle opened up in August of '59 and lasted until that drug bust in April '60, then they went under. There was another place that tried to open in Georgetown called the Cauldron, and it opened in May of 1960 and lasted until November, and it was also a beatnik type coffee house. But Georgetown was totally different from what it would be in the 70s and 80s at that time. Most of the restaurants in Georgetown offered either country music or bluegrass music. Places like the Shamrock and the Silver Dollar was a country music joint. The Frog and the Corral were country music. So the Cauldron had a tough go of it, and they were out before they were closed up before 1960 was out. The Potter's House opened at 1658 Columbia Road in the summer of 1960. It was a church-run coffee house. They were a little tamer. They closed at midnight, but they eventually got pretty heavy into social activism. They brought in a lot of speakers. That was their thing. They had folk music. Remarkably, Potter's House is still open today. And if you go in there, it is like stepping back in time. It has not changed one bit on the interiors in the past 48 years. It's pretty amazing to go in there and see that place. Two other places that came a little bit later. One was called the Unicorn Coffee House off of DuPont Circle at 17th and R. I think it was 1710 17th Street. Now there's a big condo building in its old site. The Unicorn opened in 1960. It was kind of a rundown neighborhood place. In 1961, another remarkable individual named Elliot Ryan came along and took over the Unicorn Coffee House. And I've interviewed Elliot recently. He is in declining health, but he's a great person to talk to about that whole era. He took over the Unicorn and wanted to turn it into a live music venue, and they started featuring some really great folk music entertainers. I know he had it from 61 to 64, and John Fahey used to go down there and play, and Max Oakes, and what are some of the other guys? Robbie Weaver and Eric Darling, and members of the Weavers, and Pete Lafarge. A lot of great folk musicians from DC would hang out down there, and they showed movies in there. It was a very popular place, and again, that lasted until 64. The other place that should be mentioned was a coffee house called Ontario Place Coffee House, which was up in Adams Morgan in the 1800 block of Ontario Place. They opened up in the spring of 63, and they lasted until June of 65. And Ontario Place is very well known because the house guitarist for more than a year was the great blues folk guitarist in Mississippi, John Hurt. I also found some ads where Skip James played the Ontario Place for about a month. I think that's when John Fahey and Dick Spotswood went down to the Bayou and brought him up here to play. Ontario Place, of course, was immortalized in the Bob Dylan biography, Positively Main Street, which was written by Toby Thompson, who wrote for Washingtonian Magazine, did a bunch of great books. When Dylan played Washington, D.C., I think it was in 64, after his concert, he went to Ontario Place and spent the whole night playing away. And they talk about that night in that Bob Dylan biography, Positively Main Street. Coffee and Confusion kept going until about April 1963. Then after that, you had a bunch of different coffee houses in and out. Managers came and went, owners came and went. It was the Open Way Coffee House from July of 63 to March of 64. It was the Crow's Toe Coffee House from April of 64 until December of 64. After that, it was a bunch of different places. A fellow named Teddy Portachenko came in, who was kind of a jazz drummer. It was the Lute and Lyre in 1965. It was named Portachenko's Palace for a little while. In its last version, it was called the Blue Sparrow. It was still a beatnik-type coffee house, and that lasted probably through 1967, right up to about early 1968 or so. Okay, in the mid-60s, when I talk about musical trends and certain social and cultural events, the beat movement, beat generation movement in DC was at its strongest from 59 probably till 61 or so. And it started to slowly dissipate. There was a change on the horizon. The first monumental change was when you talk about local entertainment and music, of course, it was the arrival of the British invasion. The Beatles came to town in February of 64, did their first U.S. concert at the Washington Coliseum. And then all the nightclubs started changing their formats. In Georgetown, it suddenly became very popular to book Beatles cover bands. I think the first Beatles-type band that came in was the Teejins. They played at the Frog, which was a basement club on M Street. It had been a country and western joint. The Corral switched over. The Silver Dollar switched over to rock and roll shortly after. The Bayou had been a Dixieland nightclub for years and years. They started booking the Telstars in September of 65. You had a band playing over at Rand's at 14th and I, backing up Big Al Downing. That was Brian Sandusky on guitar, Mitch Corday, Johnny Dubas, Vince Gideon. They went into the studio, recorded a song called She's the One, and released it under the name The Chartbusters. It just sounded just like the Beatles. And surprise, surprise, it charted on the Billboard charts. I think it went up to number 33. And so they had to stop backing Big Al Downing at Rand's, and they went over to the Crazy Horse. The Crazy Horse opened in late 65. The Chartbusters pretty much became a house band.